To the beginning here, can I just confirm that everyone can see my screen?
Yep, that looks great.
Okay, fantastic. Devin, do you want us to wait for a few minutes before we get started or just jump right in?
I feel like we can jump right in. It seems
Okay,
like I don't have as many waiting room.
that's
Uh,
great. Well, hello, welcome everybody to Navigating Accessibility Changes or Navigating Accessibility Updates. My name is Nora Burmeister. I am the Content Strategy Librarian at UNC Chapel Hill. I have about a decade's worth of experience dealing with accessibility in academic libraries specifically, and I am excited to share that expertise with you today. And I am co-presenting with Claire. Do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, Claire?
Hi, everyone. I'm Claire Leverett, Executive Director of NC Live, and I will be following up Nora's portion with how NC Live is helping libraries and addressing the accessibility changes.
So a little bit of an agenda for what we're going to go through today. We're going to start with some brief definitions of what accessibility is. We're going to go over the current federal laws that govern accessibility. We'll talk a little bit about the Title II regulation that was introduced almost a year ago today, what that means for libraries, and then some strategies and action items that you can utilize when you are dealing with content remediation. I will also introduce some tools that you can use to self-assess your content. So I'm going to jump right into an open question for our audience, which is, what is accessibility? When you think of accessibility, what do you think of? I like to start with some shared definitions. And I can't see the chat, so I'm going to ask Devin to call out answers as they come in. If they come in.
so we have making accommodations as needed, content that can be experienced by everyone regardless of ability, making resources available for all users. Um, Accessibility is allowing everyone to have the same opportunities, equity, providing a way for someone to access your resources no matter what their disability, helping others experience things equally.
These are fantastic definitions. Thank you all. Typically when I ask this question, I get a lot of question marks and people who aren't very familiar, but it seems like the majority of the people who are on this call, at least the people that have shared their definitions, do have an understanding of what accessibility is. When I talk about accessibility, what I'm talking about is creating experiences, designing experiences that are equitable, that are equally accessible for all patrons, all users, regardless of any kind of disability or impairment that they may have, just making sure that no matter who you are, you have the same access to content. Currently, these are the three main federal laws that govern accessibility in the United States. I do want to point out that every administration sets its own priorities around the enforcement or prioritization of litigation and legislation around any kind of content. So while these are the current federal guidelines for accessibility, it's entirely possible that these things may shift or change in the coming years based on the prioritization of these guidelines by this administration. But starting out, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act. I think most people are pretty familiar with this one. This was a law that was passed in the 1990s that prevents discrimination against any people with disabilities. Section 508 is a section of the Federal Rehabilitation Act that states that any information and communication technology that is provided by any agency that either is a part of or receives funding from the federal government cannot discriminate against people with disabilities. And since January of 2018, the Section 508 section of that Federal Rehabilitation Act has been defined by WCAG 2.0 AA, which stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and then 2.0 AA is the version of that. What has changed in the last year is the introduction of something called Title II regulations. These slides will be shared with participants following the webinar, so these links will be active in the slide and you'll be able to explore them on your own time. But Title II regulations is a memo that came out of the Department of Justice that stated that all state and local governments, web contents and mobile app usually, and there's some specific exceptions there, need to meet WCAG 2.1 AA criteria within 2 to 3 years of the introduction of that memo, which was April 24th of 2024. So you'll notice that there is a shift, an upgrading of the version of WCAG that people need to meet. That does introduce some new standards specifically around mobile app accessibility, but generally the accessibility guidelines are going to be very similar across 2.1 AA and 2.0 AA. So hopefully we've all been working to make our content accessible to the current federal guidelines, so there won't be a ton of backlog to do here. But I'm going to outline some of the things you should be thinking about as you're approaching these Title II guidelines. So this rule does apply to web content, and how they define this is the information and experiences available on the web, like text, images, sound, videos, and documents that a state or local government provides or makes available. This includes when a state or local government has an arrangement with someone else who provides or makes available web content for them. There are some minor exceptions to this, specifically around archival content and content that is kept only for record keeping or reference. There's a lot of conversations right now in libraries about what record keeping and reference and what archives means in the context of this. But I'm not going to detail those exceptions in this presentation. This is more going to be about actions that you can take. But I do recommend that you explore the full fact sheet and the full rule that is provided by the government. So the timeline for this is relatively straightforward. If you do not know that you explicitly fit into one of these first two categories, I would recommend assuming that you fit into the last category. The compliance date for these Title II guidelines has been pushed to 2027 in two circumstances, and that is for state and local governments that serve anywhere from 0 to less than 50,000 people, as well as special district governments. Now, the majority of NC Live members do not fit into one of those categories, so we're going to be approaching it as if we all need to be WCAG 2.1 AA compliant by April 24th of 2026. So what do these guidelines actually apply to? And I want to make very explicit here, I am not a lawyer, I am a librarian. I'm passionate about accessibility, but if you need concrete legal advice, I am not the person to get it from. You should refer to the counsel for your institution, but I can provide some general guidelines. So what this ruling means for libraries is that we need to make sure that our content is compliant, and that applies to web pages, to our digital catalogs, to any mobile apps that are provided by or used by your library, to PDFs that are provided by your library, ebooks provided by your library, as well as any kind of account management systems that your patrons might interact with. So what that actually means is that new content that is created after the compliance date has to meet those guidelines, as well as any resource or material that you update after that date. So what you should do in terms of approaching this is make sure that you're prioritizing the remediation of things that you use and update the most, because those are going to be the things that are required to be compliant. You might have some flexibility around things that were created prior to the compliance date, or things that are a replication of a paper or digital copy of something created prior to that compliance date. But as soon as content gets updated after that compliance date, it is beholden to these regulations. So some of the exceptions that they do outline for this rule are some third-party content and individual specific content. Individual specific content being if someone uploads their own documents that are stored within a library's account management system, those are not required to be compliant. They give the example of a personal water bill that is provided by a government in the fact sheet. That does not necessarily need to be compliant because it is individual specific. However, also PDFs, word processor files, presentations, and spreadsheets that were created prior to the compliance date, so prior to April 26th, 2026, that are not currently in use are exempt. So these are things like old versions of your library application form. These are things like archival exhibitions that you're no longer updating that are stored merely for posterity. And they do outline very specific exemptions, and you have to meet all of these in order to consider it an exemption. So it has to be retained solely for research, reference, or record-keeping purposes. It cannot be modified or updated after it has been archived, and it has to be organized and stored in a specific, clearly labeled archive area. That's where it gets a little bit tricky for libraries because libraries use a different terminology when we're talking about archives than a lot of state or government institutions. Again, for specific questions, I have to refer you back to your institution's counsel because I am not legally qualified to answer these questions. But one thing I do want to point out is that none of these exceptions will apply to essential content. So that's content that is necessary to access services, programs, or activities. So if someone has to interact with a piece of content in order to access a service or a program that your library provides, that material should be prioritized for remediation. In addition, any resource, all of your resources, including the individual specific content, including things that were created before the compliance date, must be made accessible upon request. So you have to be willing to provide an accessible version of something should a patron request it. So some strategies that I would like to recommend for anyone who's grappling with how their library is going to deal with these new guidelines is I recommend that you create an accessibility remediation plan. This helps not only to get an idea of the scope of remediation that's needed for your individual library, it also helps with documentation should any legal challenge be raised. So for this, you need to think about the pieces of content that are essential. So things like your library card applications, if you require any kind of reservation form for a study room or for a library program, these should be absolutely prioritized because these are the things that are going to be blockers if they are not accessible to someone with disabilities. Typically what we're talking about is making sure that things work with assistive technology like screen readers, like keyboard navigation, like magnifiers, and I'll outline some basic best practices later, but I highly encourage you to dig into those WCAG guidelines and to kind of figure out what you can do for your own content to remediate the accessibility to make it compliant. So this would be how I would do it. First, I would conduct an audit of all the digital content that my library provided. I would do that audit using the self-assessment tools that I'm going to outline later in this. A lot of them are the same assessment tools or similar to the tools that NC Live uses to assess their content, and Claire will talk about that later in this presentation as well. But you want to get a feel for all the platforms that you have and the content that is housed within them. So we're talking about things like LibGuides, we're talking about your catalog, we're talking about any kind of knowledge base you have, like Summon, that kind of thing. Any archival documents that are provided, any kind of record keeping or genealogy resources, you're going to want to do an assessment of these to make sure that they do meet the current and coming federal requirements. If the content is on a platform that is managed by a third party, that doesn't mean that our hands are clean, right? We still have to make an effort to make sure that that content is accessible. So if your content is managed by a third party and you do not have the ability to change or alter that content, I would recommend strongly reaching out to that vendor and stating, this is a current federal guideline, there are changes coming, we need to have this content compliant. And if it is not compliant, we will have to reassess our business relationship with this vendor. Unfortunately, this is something where there is not a lot of leeway. So if a vendor says we cannot make that compliant, you will need to reconsider whether that's a vendor that your institution can take the legal risk to continue working with. If your content is internal, then you're going to have to make some decisions. You're going to start trying to look at prioritizing that content based on what's most used and what's most necessary to the majority of your users. So we're not just looking at, this is a library card application, we have to have this ready. We're also thinking about things like, is this content very, very old? Is it likely that this is going to need more remediation? Maybe those would be prioritized higher. Our goal is to make sure that we are creating content that does not present new barriers to patrons with disabilities. So you're also going to want to make sure that your current, new, existing staff are creating content that does meet these accessibility guidelines. So I would also recommend some content authoring, trainings, or documentation for your staff. UNC has taken the approach of creating a accessibility remediation request form that is linked in areas that we know are not ideally compliant with the current federal guidelines, where we have said, this is something that we are prioritizing, this is on our roadmap of remediation, but should you need an accessible copy of this now, please place a request. So I have created a link for that in the slides that'll come through, and I would recommend that you guys are welcome to, y'all are welcome to take it wholesale, to adapt it to your needs should you need to. And then I also recommend creating a spreadsheet. We all love a spreadsheet in library science, of course. A spreadsheet of these platforms and of the content that you've identified as essential or necessary so that you can track your remediation priorities, your progress, and also so should there ever be an Office of Civil Rights complaint that comes down the pipeline for your institution, you can present them with a roadmap that you are using to actively remediate. Unfortunately, libraries have a ton of content. We are memory institutions and we hold a lot of content that may have been created long ago. UNC's Digital Accessibility Office has told us, at least, that if it is content that is a replication of a paper form, say a scanned letter that's in an archival collection, that should be lower in priority than something like an instruction request form. So we want to try to create some kind of internal guideline or internal, the word I'm looking for, some litmus tests that content will need to pass through in order to be either prioritized or deprioritized. So some of the actual hands-on ways that are going to be most impactful in how you provide this accessibility to your patrons is taking a look at the content that you can control. So in this slide, I've outlined some simple ways that you can improve the accessibility of the content that you have control over. So on your library website or on your LibGuides, you're going to want to make sure that you're using alt text whenever you use an image that is meaningful. When I say meaningful, I mean the image conveys information to a sighted user that a non-sighted user would need in order to understand the content in the same way as the sighted user did. If that image does provide meaningful information, you have to provide alt text for it. This is especially true for any images of text. A lot of times people like to add screenshots to their LibGuides to demonstrate a database interface. That's fine to do. You just need to make sure that if you are doing that, you are also replicating in text the same information transfer that you would expect from a sighted user. So if you are using a screenshot with arrows and circles to detail how someone is supposed to interact with the database, you're going to want to write that out long form and include it as basically an accessible alternative for that image. You'll also want to use meaningful text for your links. This is one of the things that I see most frequently in old LibGuides because it was a practice in the early web to say, click here, and to link the word here. However, when someone is using a screen reader to read a website to them, one of the most common ways to navigate is to jump from link to link. And if a link is labeled with the text here, they are only going to hear link here. and not actually what that link is pointing them to. So we would recommend using whatever you are linking to. Say if I wanted to say, explore the NC Live database database list by clicking here. Instead of saying clicking here, I would link NC Live database list. I would link the text that is meaningful, that communicates to our user where they will end up if they click that link. You'll also want to check your pages for correct heading structure. Heading structure should always be nested, so your page title will always be heading 1, and then below that you'll have a heading 2. If your page does not have any content beyond heading 2, then you're good with that. But you should always go in and out. So you'll say heading 1, heading 2, heading 3. If you're going back up, you got heading 2, and then back to heading 3. You never want to skip a heading level, so you never want to jump from 2 to 4. That can be really confusing for a screen reader user, again, because they utilize those headings as navigational points that they navigate through the page with. You'll also want to double check your websites for tab and keyboard navigation. You want to make sure that you have focus indicators that are showing up to indicate to someone where they are on the page. Tab and keyboard navigation are predominantly used by users who have any kind of mobility restriction that makes it difficult for them to utilize a mouse with fine motor skills. So rather than utilize a mouse, they'll use alternative navigational methods. One of the most popular is keyboard navigation. It's very simple to look up common keyboard navigation practices. You can also just tab through your own website or your own content platforms to make sure that you are having focus indicators show you where you are on the page. You'll want to check for adequate color contrast. I'll point out some tools that you can use this with. Pardon me, I've got a frog in my throat. Okay, so check for adequate color contrast. There are very specific guidelines that help people who have any kind of color blindness or vision difference, make sure that they can perceive the color on the screen in a way that means that they can actually see the contrast between the text and the background. For this reason, you're going to always want to avoid utilizing text over images because that contrast then shifts as the image background shifts. And I just always recommend that people use tables sparingly. It is possible to create an accessible table, but it does require some hand coding, specifically coding the table headers and the table data into the table itself. So if you don't feel confident with creating technological documents at that level, I just recommend use tables as sparingly as possible. For any videos that your library provides, you should be creating captions. Luckily, YouTube has been doing automatic captioning for a while. So by just uploading a video into YouTube, you will get the basic captions. But I do recommend that you spot check them at least to make sure that things like names, names of programs, names of libraries are communicated accurately. And then in terms of LibGuides, I always recommend that my content authors create their content in the visual editor specifically, rather than creating it in Word and then copy pasting it into LibGuides. When you copy and paste into LibGuides, a lot of the formatting from the original source is retained, and some of that can result in code that is represented to screen readers, but is not represented to people who are not using a screen reader. So it can result in some disparity in the experience. Okay, so how do you do this? How do you actually figure out what is and is not accessible on your content platforms? These are my 4 favorite tools for how to do this. The Wave Checker is, I couldn't do my job without it. It is a browser extension and a website that allows you to check the accessibility of any website. If you click on it, it will pull up a side panel that outlines the errors, alerts, structural features, and ARIA labels on your page. If you don't understand an error, it will provide an explanation of what that error is, as well as giving you examples of how you might fix it. It is an invaluable tool, and I highly recommend that people download it just to get a feel for what general accessibility of their web content is. That's also the tool that I predominantly use when I do an accessibility audit, to detail specifically the standards that are not being met by our current content, so that I can point content authors in the direction of how they will actually fix that. NVDA is a lightweight screen reader that is free. It is only available for Windows, but it is an easy screen reader to use. The more, I guess, advanced you get with the software that you're using for screen reader, often the more difficult it becomes to utilize that software because it involves customization of commands and keyboard controls. So I highly recommend NVDA, or if you are only a Windows user, Windows also has a built-in screen reader called Narrator, as well as a built-in magnification tool called Magnifier that you can explore. This link just points you to the basics of keyboard and tab navigation so that you can see how to move through your website with tabs. Shift tab will move you back, tab will move you forward, but also some of the more common controls used by keyboard navigation users. And then I also pointed you to a colorblind web page filter where you can enter your website URL in and get a visual depiction of what it might look like to someone who's experiencing several types of colorblindness. So these are tools that I would recommend using to conduct an audit. You can use them in concert, you can use just the wave checker, but I do recommend some proactive assessment of where the errors in accessibility are so that you can figure out where is going to be the most impactful to focus your compliance efforts. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment while I turn it over to Claire to talk more about NC Live and accessibility.
Thank you, Nora. I was wondering, we have a few questions in the chat. I was wondering if we should go ahead and address those before I.
Okay, let's look here. I'm scrolling up.
So we have a question from Elle asking, would language tools also be included in accessibility standards, i.e. non-English readers and speakers?
Yeah, can you give me an example of a language tool?
I don't know if maybe they're referring to transparent language, which NC Live has, like
I was just thinking in general, like having other options where a page could be translated. I didn't know if those were included with the accessibility standards of this, or is that something like that library should also look out for?
Yeah, so I think from a usability perspective, it's always a great idea to provide alternative points of access. So if someone, you know, I've seen those websites where it says view this page in Spanish or view this page in French, you know. That's not specifically an accessibility related issue, but I would categorize it as something that you can do to improve usability. Does that answer your question? Okay.
We have Colleen asking, if a table is created in a visual editor in SpringShare, is it already accessible? Are Google spreadsheets already accessible? I had not considered either of these ideas related to accessibility before.
So I don't know off the top of my head for Google spreadsheets. For SpringShare, I will say it's going to depend, unfortunately, on the date that it was created because SpringShare has changed its visual editor over the years. So if you are an institution like UNC, which has content that's a decade old, I would start reviewing the older content first to make sure that that content was accessible. Our staff has found that a lot of the times content that typically would be conveyed as a table can also be conveyed as a list or as a series of boxes rather than as a table. Tables are not the friendliest with mobile display because if you are viewing them on a mobile device, it can cause some page breaks that get pretty uncomfortable. But yeah, Google likely has a VPAT or some kind of accessibility documentation that we could look at. Claire can talk a little bit more about VPATs later. But yeah, I recommend if you're unsure about any vendor or any product, Googling the name of that product or the name of that vendor with accessibility to get a feel for what they're putting out there. And then I see a question from Rashara. Do these guidelines apply to internal staff tools or just public-facing ones? So these guidelines specifically apply to public-facing content. However, this is a soapbox of mine. If you want to be a truly accessible institution, you need to provide staff tools that are also accessible, or you are de facto saying, I will not hire someone who is disabled. And that is something that I don't think any of our institutions want to do. But for the purposes of this specific guideline, this is public-facing content. They're not going to be auditing your back-end systems. I would recommend, whenever possible, prioritizing accessibility in your staff systems as well as in your public systems, however. I see Troy. Oh, thank you. We've got some Google information. So yes, we have great expertise in the chat as well. You still have to do some manual work to make Google Docs slide sheets fully accessible. And Microsoft Office programs have a very robust accessibility checker. Yeah, Office is my preferred accessible content authoring tool. It also has really great accessibility features like the immersive reader that helps students that need focus help. It's got dictation, speech to text, if you have someone that needs that. So they can be really useful tools as well. And please feel free to keep dropping stuff in the chat while Claire is talking. I'll keep my eyes open, and if there's other questions I can address later, I'm happy to.
All right, thank you, Nora. I actually have a couple of questions for you.
Yeah, okay, I'll see what I can do.
So one is on LibGuides, because this question has come up before about how do I make LibGuides accessible? And I know we have a lot of libraries that use a lot of LibGuides and depend on that for their website or for additional resources. Is that something where they can just email SpringShare and hope that SpringShare will make the LibGuides interface accessible, or is that work that each institution kind of has to do individually?
So I think complicated answer. SpringShare recently introduced an accessibility concierge service where you can basically email SpringShare, pay an additional fee, and say, point out the places where my LibGuides can be made more accessible. They're not going to do it for you. They're basically going to do the work of auditing content for you if you choose to take that upgrade for their system. I think it's a mix of advocacy and work on your own content. We definitely, UNC as an institution advocates regularly with SpringShare to create content tools that are accessible. Their date picker recently went through some updates to make it more accessible, and I have to hope that that is partially due to the advocacy because we've been asking for that feature for years. You can submit requests in the SpringShare Lounge for accessibility enhancements, and other people can vote on them. So I think that you can advocate for more accessible tools, but you also have to take responsibility for your own content. One of the things that I recommend for anyone who is kind of the manager of a SpringShare instance is to create a guide that models those accessible practices and also details them. So create a guide that says you have to create alt text on images, have a screenshot showing how to add alt text to the images, and then add the alt text to that image so people can look at it and see, oh, that's how they did that. So basically create a document that both demonstrates and documents the need for different content type accessibilities. What was your next question?
I'd had kind of a question about the part of the ruling or the text of the ruling that talks about the undue financial or administrative burdens, and thinking about like if there are certain areas of your website or online content that would be a huge hardship to make accessible, like you had to hire a lot of additional staff members, or maybe it's like a unique item that you can't get or buy anywhere else. Just wondering how that impacts libraries.
I think that that's a really good point, because no one has the capacity to remediate every single piece of content that their library provides. I can speak, UNC Chapel Hill has 4 million plus archival documents that are, cursive text, handwritten. There's no way that we have the staff capacity to do that. But what we can do is document these kind of pools of content and make sure that we know where they are, we know that they have a need to be remediated, and we are trying to keep an eye on AI tools that are being developed that help with that remediation. There's some really good tools coming out around transcription. We have a program at UNC called Abby Fine Reader that helps create transcriptions of archival documents, or at least text documents that have not gone through an optical character recognition process. But what I would say is, I think we should be leaning on that undue financial burden as something to say, we have a huge pool of content. We're not going to get it all remediated before 2026. But what I don't want to do is use it as an excuse, right? I don't want to say, well, I'm one person, and so I don't even need to start looking at what I can make accessible because I don't have the time for it, and it would be an undue financial burden for me to do it. I think that if we're going to approach these rulings in good faith as a library community, we need to be realistic with ourselves about what we do have the capacity to do and prioritizing things based on usage and need. So I think that while that is a useful caveat, and it's definitely one that I think UNC will point to with a lot of its archival remediation, should a complaint ever come down, it is not something that I would recommend starting from as like a starting point.
All right, thank you, Nora.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for the questions. Any other questions before Claire gets started? All right.
Okay. I'll go ahead and share my screen. And thank you so much, Nora, for sharing all of your expertise. We're so lucky to have you in our North Carolina community.
Well, I'm always happy to help if you have a specific question or you want to just chat accessibility. I think my email is in these slides somewhere, but if not, I'll drop it in the chat now.
Yes, that is wonderful. All right, so I'm going to be talking about how NC Live is looking to address accessibility and help libraries with their accessibility needs. So the good news is that we have already been doing this work. We already have a head start on this work. It all started with our 2023 to 2026 NC Live strategic plan, which we did in 2022. And in that planning process, we received a lot of feedback from member libraries that they wanted help with accessibility. So we started doing this work in 2022 and advocating for the accessibility of our resources on a statewide level. And we've performed accessibility audits of all of our subscription resources and our permanent resources. And the great news is that all of our vendors have been very responsive to our requests. They want to work with us, and all issues that we have identified have either been fixed or are in development. And we've also added accessibility language into all of our licensing agreements as well. So I'll go into more detail on some of these things later. Another thing that works well for us is that the 2026 compliant date is coming up, and we are also starting up our next 3-year resource licensing period, which will start on January 1st, 2026. So we can use this upcoming, January 1st, 2027. So we're starting our resource selection process now. It will continue through next year, and we can use this upcoming licensing date as leverage to get vendors to comply with these standards. And vendors who do not comply, we will let them know you will be highly scrutinized by our resource advisory committee. We are also very lucky to have Nora, who is a part of our resource advisory committee, so she will make sure we are keeping up to date and keeping on top of all these accessibility standards for our resources. So I've already emailed all of our vendors about this new ruling, just to give them a heads up that we are expecting them to be in compliance by April 2026. And I've already heard back from several of them that they are at the level that they need to be, the WCAG 2.1 AA standard. So that's great. And I have a little spreadsheet and I'm like checking them off when I hear back from them. So we're going to keep on top of them and make sure that we're doing this work, not just because it's now the law, but because we know that it's important work for our libraries and for our users. So the main theme of this slide is that we want to do this work at a statewide level for you, so you don't have to worry about it for your NC Live resources. It's so much more efficient and effective if we do this at a centralized level, and you all don't have to duplicate all of this work yourselves. We also want to be able to provide support for libraries as they do this work in their own institutions. So we'll be talking about this more in our advisory committees and gathering feedback from all of you. How can we support your library so you have the resources that you need to make these changes? So this is a timeline, brief timeline of our accessibility work. We started in fall 2022 with the accessibility audit of our subscription e-resources. In summer 2023, we added the accessibility clause to all of our licenses, which I'll share in a few slides. In January 2024, we performed, and when I say we, I guess I actually mean our Online Services Advisory Committee performed an accessibility audit of new resources and our permanent resources. In summer 2024, we added the accessibility filter to our A to Z database list on the NC Live website. And I also emailed all of our vendors to contact them about the Title II update. And in summer 2025, this summer and this fall, we'll be conducting accessibility audit again of all of our subscription e-resources in preparation for our resource selection cycle. So we have created a regular schedule for our accessibility audit work to make sure we're doing it regularly. So here's just more details on the tools that we use to perform our accessibility audits. I'm sharing this workflow just in case it's helpful for you as you're performing your own audits. We used Lighthouse, which is a Chrome plugin, to get an overall numeric score when we looked at our resources. The score is out of 100. So we, thought it would be especially helpful for the reports that we provided our Resource Advisory Committee as they were evaluating our resources. So this way they could easily glance at the report and get a sense of how well the resource is doing accessibility-wise. Because the score is out of 100, it's really easy to kind of, in your mind, compare it to like, oh, this is an A, or this is a B, or this is like a D result, and really easily kind of judge how well is this resource doing. So we only use the Lighthouse score for our internal reports. So we didn't use it for the reports that we sent to the vendors because we wanted the vendors to focus on the actual issues that needed to be remediated, not how well they were doing overall. But like Nora mentioned, we use the Wave plugin, which can be a plugin on your Chrome browser to get the specific accessibility errors on each resource page. We use the errors from the Wave tool in our internal reports for the RAC and also the reports that we sent to the vendors. And we looked at 3 different pages for when we did the accessibility audits. We looked at the landing page, the search results page, and the record level pages. And in Wave, it also, once you get the error messages, there's like an information box that you can click on, and it will give you more information on the error. And a lot of times it actually tells you the WCAG standard that the error applies to. So you can see if it applies to that 2.1 AA standard. In addition, we also performed manual checks that are not available in Wave. So these were the logical tab order to make sure you can tab through a page, interactive controls, and making sure a user is not accidentally trapped in a region, which also has to do with tabbing and make sure they can go through the full page with their keyboard. This was our Google Forms that we used, that the Online Service Advisory Committee used when performing the audits. So sharing these again in case it's helpful for your workflow. I think it made the process simpler in that people performing the audit knew exactly what information they were looking for and what steps they needed to take and what information to gather when performing the audit. And they submitted the form, and then that all went to one centralized location where then NC Live staff could look through it and kind of tabulate it and bring it all together. This is a sample of our internal reports that we used for our Resource Advisory Committee. So you can see the Lighthouse accessibility score at the top, and then we had a score for each page and the accessibility errors. And then this was the report that we sent to our vendors, which was mainly just the errors that we found on Wave. So we have added accessibility documentation to our website. That way, member libraries can view the work that we've done and use the same documentation in their own work. Once again, to help prevent duplication. And so you all it just makes your work more streamlined. So to our terms of use page, which I'll show you in a second, we've added the audit reports, vendor responses to our reports, the status of an issue related to the resources accessibility, and it also has the VPATs and accessibility statements from all of our vendors. So I'll show that to you really quickly so you know where to find it. So on our About page, if you go to accessibility in terms of use, it's just all on this page. So we have all of our resources listed. You can see accessibility statement and VPAT. You can see the accessibility audit and when we last performed it, and either a status report, which has any issues in documentation, or if all issues have been resolved, then we've put that as well. And then down here, you can have, we've listed a description about the accessibility evaluation process that we use. So you can get more information there as well. All right, back into the slideshow. So we've also added accessibility language to all of our licenses. We developed this language with our attorneys at the UNC System Legal Office, and we based it on licensing advice from them and also from NC Live member institutions. We had 11 licenses and amendments signed in spring 2023, and 10 out of 11 of those vendors accepted NC Live's proposed licensing language with no changes. One vendor made minor modifications to NC Live's language, so we were very happy with that result. And our licensing language, this is the clause that we use in all of our licenses, and it does require vendors to be to that WCAG 2.1 AA standard. So that's the same standard as this ruling. So they're already on the hook to be up to this standard. And we also asked them to provide us with a VPAT and that they promptly respond to and resolve any accessibility concerns that we bring to them. So this is the accessibility filter that we added in summer 2024. We added a filter to our Browse A to Z databases page that has main accessibility features. And this could be a really great tool when you're working with patrons or users in your library. If someone comes wanting a certain accessibility feature, you can come over to the NC Live website and select the filter for the features they want, and it will filter to the resources that have those features. So this is another suggestion that came out of our accessibility survey and feedback that we gathered from member libraries. So we're hoping this will help libraries as well. So in summer 2024, as I mentioned, I emailed all of our vendors, alerting them to the new Title II changes, and this is the email that I sent them. So just was alerting them here the basics of this ruling, told them that 179 out of 209 NC Live member libraries are expected to be in full compliance with the new rules. So I was really emphasizing how important it was to our membership that our resources are in compliance, and requested their assistance in meeting these obligations. So if you would like to use this template, you're welcome to use it. I based my template off of a template from the Library Accessibility Alliance, and I have linked to that template letter at the bottom of this email in case you find that letter helpful as well. So next steps for NC Live. We are performing an accessibility audit of our subscription e-resources again in preparation for our upcoming resource selection cycle. We will be ensuring that nclive.org and the NC Live website service are updated to the required standards. We also will be following up with our vendors in preparation for April 2026. The vendors who are still working on compliance or who I did not hear back from, we'll be following up with them. And we'll continue to provide communication and support for libraries and look for ways that we can continue to support libraries. So guess we have a few minutes left. So I'm interested to do a quick poll just to get more information from you for how you would like to be supported in this work. And I guess maybe I should ask Devin first. Do we have any questions that I can answer?
I had a question that Rashara asked for you and Nora. Do the audit tools you've recommended work for downloadable mobile apps, or is there a different way to evaluate those? And Nora shared Wave Checker can be used as a mobile checker if you use the URL interface, but it's unwieldy. However, WebAIM does provide guidelines and tools to help assess mobile interfaces. Both Android and iOS have built-in screen readers that you can use. Okay.
That's good. That's good question and good information as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so I will pop over to the Mentimeter poll, and you're welcome to put your answer in the chat as well if that's easier for you. But this is the poll. It's just going to be an open-ended question. How can NC Live support you? And Devin, maybe, what do you think? Like 3, oh yeah, if you could put the chat, the URL in the chat, will maybe take like 3 minutes to do it, two or 3.
Yeah, a couple minutes. We have a question that Molly just put in the chat. How much of this work that you've been doing with vendors is specific to your organization and implementations, and how much would it be helpful to everyone facing these new rules?
Well, I mean, our work with the vendors would be helpful to everyone. Anyone who licenses from these vendors, our content from vendors is not specific to NC Live. It's for anyone who licenses those resources. So yeah, I mean, that's the great thing about consortial work nationwide, is that, and like the work that the Library Accessibility Alliance has been doing, is that those improvements will help libraries all over the country.
For UNC, I don't work directly with our vendors for things like databases. I work with our content platform managers, but I'm always happy to share any specific findings or recommendations. Most of the things that I recommend are things that are freely available to find through things, something like the Wave Checker. Recommendations like adult texture images is not specific to my organization, but it is something that is freely available. So I see a hand raised from Sarah.
I'm just thinking about, I asked a question earlier in the chat about if vendors are being subjected to, not subjected to, but if vendors are being affected by this as well. But I guess I'm wondering now, Claire, since you've sent these letters and, vendors are aware, do you have a sense that they are, even like the vendors maybe that NC Live doesn't work with, that they are proactively responding to this? And I guess I'm kind of wondering, do you really anticipate that it'll come down to libraries saying, we can't work with you anymore because you don't meet these requirements? Or what vibe do you have from vendors?
Most vendors seem very eager to do this work, and it seems like they actually appreciate when I send them, here are the errors we found. It seems like they really appreciate getting that that feedback and doing that work, because I think that they realize that it is really important to libraries. There is the European accessibility, maybe Nora can help me, I'm like blanking on the law, but there was
PD.
Yeah, there was a European law that was passed that actually has a deadline of 2025. So any vendors that are selling in Europe already have to be doing this work for Europe. So that also gives us an advantage as well. I think it is going to be harder for the smaller vendors. And, I think some of our smaller vendors don't have as much capacity to do this work. Like our larger vendors, some of them like have a whole team or a whole like department of people that is able to do this work and stay on top of it. So they are much more ready and willing to do this work. The smaller vendors have a harder time with it. So I think, some of it might come down to as well, like how unique is this resource and is it the only one that provides this information? And that may also factor into whether libraries can say like, sorry, we can't subscribe, or we need to, and I guess also what their campus legal or their kind of overarching legal authority, how much of a risk they feel like letting the library take in subscribing to something that can't be compliant by the date. So I guess that's my current feeling on it. Nora, what are your thoughts on that?
I agree with that. I think vendors are getting a lot of advocacy from their institutions saying that this is something that we need if we're going to continue working with you. I do think we have to be prepared to say, if you aren't able to make this accessible, then we will seek an alternative resource that is willing to make something accessible. The most recent census findings are 20% of the U.S. population experiences a disability. So that's a huge portion of our populations that we will be disenfranchising if we choose to work with vendors that do not prioritize accessibility. It also opens us up for potential legal liability should the product not be up to snuff, and the Office of Civil Rights comes after the institution because they don't have any clause for the vendor. So I do think it's important to be willing to follow up these letters with possibly difficult decisions if there are vendors that choose not to comply. That said, I think worked with maybe one vendor who said, we just don't have the staff to do this. And again, like Claire said, the smaller vendors are going to struggle more. I think similarly, if you can get roadmaps and remediation kind of timelines from them, that would go a long way for me towards indicating that this is something that they are ideologically aligned on with our institution. Even if they say, we can't do this right now. I worked with Social Explorer probably 5 years ago at this point, and they said map accessibility is really different or really difficult to do well. This is something that we want to do, but we can't do it right away. Is that something that you're willing to have some flexibility on? And we said, absolutely, if you can make these major changes to improve the accessibility of your interface, this is something that we can kind of wait on because we know that it is difficult. So I think if there are vendors that you work with independently that are outside of NC Live, just starting those conversations can go a long way towards like getting a feel for who is going to be willing to work with you and who is going to decide that your business is not as important to them.
All right.
We have a couple of questions that came in the chat. I just want to share them out really quickly. Is there any work being done regarding audits among different library consortia so that each library or library consortia doesn't have to be repeating this work?
Yeah, I mean, the Library Accessibility Alliance is the first one that comes to mind, and I believe, Devin, you put that in the chat. So they have done a lot, I know, and I continue to do some. So that's the first one that comes to mind for me.
Yeah, I haven't heard a lot about consortial work going on outside of NC Live and ASCRL. I know the Big Ten has done a lot of work around accessibility in the past, but specifically around the Title II rulings. I've seen a webinar from ASCRL probably a month or two ago, and then this one from NC Live. So I think it's a pretty new topic, honestly, that a lot of people are kind of figuring out how to approach and how to deal with. So I love to see consortial work being done around this so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Also want to talk about the question that just came in from L. Caldwell, asking, does WCAG extend to the physical space of the library, or is it specifically for online resources? WCAG is specifically for online resources, because that's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. The Americans with Disabilities Act does still apply to the physical space of the library, but it is not impacted by this Title II ruling. They have very specific guidelines about how wide door frames need to be, how tall tables need to be, the turning radius that needs to be available for someone who is, say, a wheelchair user to utilize that space, but it will not be impacted by the Title II ruling. It's a great question.
All right, and I also just wanted to say, we didn't get to go over the Mentimeter results or all of the comments, but I really appreciate all of your comments, and I will be looking through them and sharing them with our committees. So really appreciate your thoughts on that.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks so much, Claire and Nora. You've given us so much info and resources. Folks, keep an eye out for a follow-up email tomorrow with the link to the slides, the recording, and a feedback survey. In that feedback survey, feel free to share recommendations for future webinars, whether they cover accessibility or other topics. Our training program is responsive to what is timely and relevant and of interest to our member libraries. So thank you all so much for joining us this Wednesday afternoon.
Great, thank you.
Take care, y'all.
Bye.